Hello and welcome to Clumsy Crafting. This is episode 3 and I am your host, Bray Ray. So as I said at the end of last episode, today I'm going to teach you some advanced knitting techniques. Well, I say advanced, but they're really more intermediate techniques, but let's just say they're more advanced than beginner, which is what I taught you in the first episode. Now, something to note in this episode is that I'm not teaching you full patterns. I'm teaching you abbreviations and stitches and knitting techniques that you would generally be assumed to know in a pattern. These include increases and decreases, as well as a couple of basic stitch types. My basic thought was that any complicated pattern will tell you what they want you to do, whereas these abbreviations and these types of stitches won't really be explained unless it's like a very basic pattern. They kind of just assume you know it. So once again, I am using my size 4 worsted weight acrylic yarn in aqua. Same one I've been using all series. I'm also using a pair of size 8 DPNs, or double pointed needles. Double pointed needles are normally used for knitting in circular, or knitting in the round as they call it, but I'm just choosing to use them because they're a bit shorter, so it's easier for me to work with them within the frame. They're also just a good color that contrasts against the yarn, which is a thing I definitely want every time I'm showing off stitches, because I want you to be able to tell the difference between the needle and the yarn. I've also got a couple of rows of garter stitch just already ready to go, just so that I have a basis to start from. I'm not starting from my first row, because generally when you're doing these knitting increases and decreases, you're doing them in a project that's already got a good chunk of knitting done. You're not doing it your first or second row. Generally. Some patterns are different, obviously, but it's a good standby. Now I'm going to start out here by teaching you a couple knitting decreases, or stitches that will help you decrease the number of stitches you are currently knitting. Now, like I said in the first episode, you generally want to start and end with the same number of stitches. Now that's for square and rectangular projects, like the little square of stitches we did. But if you're doing like shaped projects like hats or gloves or socks, you're obviously going to want to change the shape and the width and the length of the knitting. And the way you do that is by adding or removing stitches from your knitting. So decreasing stitches are very important. Most of these stitches also have specific abbreviations tied to them. I will put those abbreviations on the screen because obviously it's much easier to see it, and then you can connect it with what you see in the pattern. Now the first stitch that I'm going to teach you is a knit 2 together, or a K2 TOG, as you can clearly see on the screen. And this is basically where you knit 2 stitches together. It's pretty simple, does exactly what it says. I'm going to knit up a couple stitches here real quick, just because you generally aren't doing increases and decreases at the end or the beginning of a row. But now I'm here in the middle, so I'm going to show you. And you go in through the second stitch from the tip. You go in and you make sure that both of your needles are through both stitches. Your right needle will be on the bottom, your left needle on top. And then just like every other knitting, you wrap around, you pull up a loop, and you drop off the 2 stitches you're knitting with. And see, you'll notice there's a little bit of a loop there. And generally after that, you're just going to keep knitting the rest of the way, same as you've always done. And that is how you do a knit 2 together. You just go in through both stitches and you knit. Now I'm going to quickly speed through the rest of this row just so that I can show you it at the end, and then we'll take a look at what the K2 together looks like. Alright, so here we can take a look at our K2 together. And you can kind of see there's a little bit of an extra bump where the 2 loops are pulled to the side. And now we are down to 14 stitches instead of the 15 we started with. Now, something to note is that a knit 2 together is a right-leaning decrease, whereas there's another kind of decrease called an SSK that is left-leaning. Now SSK stands for slip, slip, knit, and that's basically what the stitch is. And obviously, depending on whichever way you want your piece to lean, that's the decrease you're going to choose. So if you want it to go right, you're going to pick a K2 together. If you want it to go left, you're going to pick a slip, slip, knit. Now I'm just knitting a few stitches here so that I have a space to work with. And now what you're going to want to do for a slip, slip, knit is you're going to go into the first stitch and pull it off the needle. Don't do anything, just pull it off the needle. Do the same with the second stitch. These are your 2 slip stitches. Then you're going to take the left needle and go in through the 2 slipped stitches so that your needles are pointing toward you and that your right needle is on top. Then you're going to wrap the yarn around, pull up a loop, and slide both stitches off the needle. And then you have done a slip slit knit. Viewers are probably asking, well, why does it matter which way it leans? Both of them decrease. Why do we need to have 2 separate ones? And that has to do with this thing called shaping, which means that if you want your piece to have a certain shape, then your stitches need to follow that shape. So if you want a sock that has 2 sides that lean in, you're going to need to make sure that the stitches on both sides lean in on the direction you want them to. If you don't use the right shaping stitch, your piece will look very wonky, and you don't want that. You want a nice, clean piece. Now I'm just going to finish up knitting the rest of this row, and then I'll show you what the stitch looks like. And so once again, you can kind of see there's just like this little extra loop where you did the decrease. You can also see that the edges of your knitting are starting to lean in, and that's because you start out with 15 stitches and now you're down to 13. So your nice straight sides are starting to slant a little as you decrease. And again, that goes back to shaping. What shape do you want the piece to look like? Now I'm going to show you the final way of decreasing your knitting. And this one actually decreases it by 2 stitches instead of the 1. And this is called a slip 1, knit 2 together, pass slip stitch over. It's a fairly long abbreviation, mostly because it's like 3 stitches in one. And it's a little confusing to explain, but it'll be very obvious once we start knitting and we get into it. So once again, I'm just going to knit a couple stitches in just so that I have that room to start, and then I'll show you how to do the stitch. So again, you're going to start by simply slipping that first stitch onto your right needle. Then you're going to knit together the next 2 stitches, just like you did with the knit 2 together. Make sure you're in both, wrap it, and then pull up a loop and drop. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle, go in through the slip stitch, and pull it over the knit 2 together. And that's how you do a slip 1, knit 2 together, pass slip stitch over. And I know this talk of slip stitch is a little bit confusing, especially in regards to our crocheting video, but generally slipping and knitting means that you're not doing anything to the stitch. It just means you're passing it on to the next needle. And now you can see we are now down to 11 stitches. Our sides are very slanted in, and you can very clearly see where you knitted the 2 together and passed the stitch over. Our knitting looks a little bit funky at the moment because we did so many decreases so close together. Generally, when you're knitting a pattern, your decreases will be separated by a set number of stitches and rows, and you'll generally keep the 2 different kinds of stitches separate depending on what you're doing. Now I'm going to teach you a couple of knitting increases. Now the simplest way to do a knitting increase is to make a loop, usually a slip stitch, with your yarn, and throw it on the end of the needle. But again, that really only adds loops on the ends of your knitting. And what if you want to add a loop in the middle of your knitting? Well, there's a few different ways of going about that. Personally, my favorite way of adding stitches in while knitting is to knit front and back. This is abbreviated KFB. Now, knitting front and back is actually super easy, despite what it sounds. You just knit into the front of the stitch and the back of the stitch, and as soon as I show you it, it will make so much sense. So what you're going to want to do is go into the first stitch on the left needle, wrap and pull up a loop, then go in through the other side, wrap and pull up a second loop, and then drop the first stitch. I know my video here isn't the best. Unfortunately, my camera cut out while I was filming the much slower version, but I swear it's just as easy as it sounds. You go in and you knit normally, but before dropping, you just go in through the back and knit a second loop in the same stitch. Now I've done 2 rows since last time we spoke, so now I should be back up to 13 stitches total. And I'm going to try to get us back up to our 15 total stitches before we finish. And once again, you can kind of see that the rows are starting to stretch out again, whereas they squished in during the decrease. Now I'm going to teach you the last increase that you'll generally encounter in knitting patterns. This is the easiest way of increasing your stitches, but it's also very obvious when you do it, so you generally don't want to do it unless you're going for a very specific look. Generally, you're going to want to add one on at the end or knit front and back. Now this type of increase is called a yarn over. It's usually abbreviated as YO in patterns. And it's pretty simple. It's just what the name says. You take your yarn and you wrap it over your working needle, and then you just continue knitting as usual. And when you go back to it in the future rows, you just knit it the way you would a normal stitch. And I'm going to do 2 yarn overs in this row just to make sure that I hit that 15 stitch mark. And once again, you're just going to wrap the yarn over the needle and continue knitting. Now see, we've got our 15 stitches all back, and you can kind of tell where the yarn overs are. There is a little bit of a hole in the knitting, and that's what I was talking about. Whenever you do a yarn over, it becomes blatantly obvious that you've done a yarn over because it creates a little hole in the knitting. Now I'm going to teach you another shaping technique called a short row. And I've given myself a little bit of space for my increases and decreases. I knitted a row while we were apart. And basically with a short row, you're going to knit to a certain point within the row, and then you're going to turn and knit back, and then turn and knit back again. So I'm just going to knit my first couple of stitches here, my first short row. Now we've got our stitches knitted, so we can start working on our short row. Now the whole point of short row is you just sort of knit in, and then generally you turn the work. And you can do that really plainly by just turning it and knitting back without doing anything fancy, which is what I'm going to briefly show to you. But this actually isn't what you're going to want to do, because generally short row instructions will tell you to wrap and turn, because if you just turn it, you're going to put a hole in the knitting when you go to knit back. Now, I'm obviously showing you the wrong way on purpose, but I will go back and show you the right way of wrapping and turning. Now I've finished up my short row, and you can see there's a very clear gap in the knitting, and that gap will become a hole when you knit back. And you don't want there to be a hole in the knitting. So what I'm going to do real quickly is I'm going to unravel the short row that I just made, and then I'm going to show you how to wrap and turn. Now the way that you wrap is you slip the first stitch that is not knitted onto your needle. You just slip it, you don't knit it, you don't do anything to it, you just slip it. And then you're going to pull the yarn towards you or away from you, depending on whichever way you're knitting. And then you're going to slip the stitch back onto the other needle, just so that the yarn is wrapped around it. You're wrapping, and then you're going to turn both your needles and knit your short row back the other way. Finish up knitting this real quick, and then I will show you what the short row actually looks like in the knitting. Now generally with short rows, you're not going to do them one row after another. You're going to do a short row and then a normal row and then a short row, which is what I did. I did a full row after my short row. And if you look, you can kind of see that the side in which I did the short row is angled up slightly, and that's because there are more knitted rows on that side. That's the whole point of a short row, is to add height and shape to the piece. You'll also notice the rest of the knitting is a little janky because we've got all those increases and decreases, and you can clearly see my yarn over holes and all the places where I pulled my stitches left and right while increasing and decreasing. Just for the record, though it was probably obvious, I'm not expecting you all to follow along with this. This is very clearly me just doing a bunch of stitches to show you how to do stitches. Now what I've been showing you so far are basically what I call structural stitches. They're stitches you do within a bigger pattern to get a specific look or to make the project change shape in some way. Increases, decreases, short rows. The next few stitches I'm going to show you are more appearance-based, and they're a lot more similar to garter stitch and stockinette stitch because it's not just one stitch you do in a row of stitches, it's a thing you do throughout a row in order to achieve a certain look. So just like how a garter stitch is all knit stitches and a stockinette is alternating those knit and those purl rows, these next few stitches will do something within the rows in order to achieve a certain look. The first one I'm going to teach you is a ribbing. Now a ribbing or a rib stitch is very simple. It is one of the most basic patterns, and it is knit one, purl one, all the way down the row. That's all you're going to do. You're going to knit a stitch, and then you're going to purl a stitch, and then you're going to pull the yarn in between when you do them. So see, I'm pulling my yarn back so that I can purl, and then I'm going to pull it forward and away from me so that I can knit. That's all you're doing is knitting and purling. Now what's interesting about a ribbing is that it's a lot stretchier than other types of stitches, and that's because you keep pulling that yarn in between the stitches. So at the end of this I'll show you, and it will stretch so much more than the garter stitch at the bottom. Now what's really important in ribbing is to make sure that you start the next row with the opposite of your last stitch. So if you purled your last stitch, you're going to knit the first stitch of the second row. If you knitted the last stitch of your first row, you're going to purl the first stitch of your last row. And this will make sure that all of the stitches in that column of stitches are facing the same direction. And that's what you want in a ribbing. You want it to look like distinct columns. Now I'm just finishing up my last row of ribbing here. I've done 3 or 4 rows just so that you can see what it looks like. And there are those distinct columns I talked about, and that's from alternating the knit stitch and the purl stitch. You should have a column that's sort of pushed out that looks like little arrows, and a column pushed in that is just sort of bumps. Similar to how a stockinette stitch looks. And as you can see in the video, the ribbing stitch is much stretchier than the garter stitch because of that constantly moving the yarn between stitches. And that's why we use ribbing for like the cuffs and the collars of sweaters, because it is so much stretchier and it will go back to its shape. You also don't have to do a ribbing that's just 1 stitch purling and 1 stitch knitting. You can change it up. You can do 2 stitches knitting to 2 stitches purling. You can do 5 stitches knitting to 5 stitches purling. It's really up to you and what you want the ribbing to look like. Now I'm going to teach you the 4th most common kind of stitch, and this is called a seed stitch. Now, just like a ribbing, you're going to knit 1, purl 1, all the way down the row. What's different from a ribbing is how you start the rows. So, if you end your row in a purl stitch, you're going to start the next row with a purl stitch. If you end your row with a knit stitch, you're going to start your next row with a knit stitch. So rather than the distinct columns of a ribbing, where you have every stitch going the same way, this will create a mixture of the bumps and the arrows that you get from knitting and purling. These alternating stitches will give your knitting a very interesting texture, which is part of the reason why people love to use the seed stitch for scarves. I'm going to do a few rows and then I'll show you what it looks like, and you should be able to see a very distinct difference from the ribbing and the garter stitch. Now you can clearly see the texture I was talking about. It's got the combination of the pulled stitches towards us and the arrows of the stitches pulled away from us. It's a very fun and interesting texture, but obviously it's not perfect for everything. For instance, socks with a seed stitch might get annoying after a while. But it is a very cool stitch and you should definitely experiment with it. Just remember to make sure you start every row with the same stitch that you ended on. So today on Clumsy Crafting, you learned how to decrease your knitting, increase your knitting, how to wrap and turn your short rows, how to do a ribbing stitch, and how to do a seed stitch. I had a wonderful time crafting with you, and I hope you had a super fun time crafting with me. This is Clumsy Crafting, and I am your host, Bray Wright. Have a lovely day.